And I'm so pleased today to be in conversation with debut novelist Brinda Charry about her new book, The East Indian. On behalf of the store, I'd like to say thank you all for spending this rainy Saturday afternoon with us and supporting not only a fantastic author and a great book, but also your local independent bookstore. By being here today, you're part of our community, and we thank you so much for joining us. Brinda, our author of the evening, came to the United States from India as a graduate student in 1999 and has been living here ever since. She is a novelist turned academic returned novelist, a specialist in English Renaissance literature, Shakespeare and contemporary. She's published a number of books and articles in that field. The East Indian will be her first novel published in the United States. She currently lives in Keene, New Hampshire, with her husband and dog. The East Indian is a novel inspired by a single line of history, the historical footnote that an East Indian arrived in the Virginia colony in the mid-17th century. Although he's never mentioned again, this novel expands upon his story, imagining how he came to this continent, the lives he lives, the prejudices he faces, and the dreams he pursues in spite of the hardships that afflict him and the people around him. The East Indian has been named a Washington Post Notable Book for May, an American Booksellers Association Indie Next Pick, and has received numerous positive reviews. NPR says, Brinda Charry has beautifully pioneered a much-needed path forward into rich, new literary territory. New York Journal of Books says The East Indian is a historical novel in the finest sense, as it illuminates a time and place through the lives of fictional characters and imagined events with exceptional skill. And E.C. Osondu calls it brilliant, highly imaginative, immersive, and revelatory. So I would love to get into this book. Please join me in welcoming Brinda. Well, welcome. How has it been to have this book out in the world?
It's been surreal in some days, as we were just saying, a fellow author and I were just saying, it's in your head for a long, long time, and then it's out there, and readers, and it's a strange, fantastic feeling.
Well, I've been seeing that some of the responses from readers have been very, very positive. Has anyone reached out to you directly yet, or is that still to come?
A few have, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of people here haven't read the book yet. Just to get us going, could you share a bit about Tony and his story?
Yeah, I was inspired by, as Alex said, I was inspired by something I came across. It was in an article, and then I found the name in the archives. There was a mention of a person labeled an East Indian, identified as an East Indian, who came to Virginia in the year 1635. And I found him I eventually tracked him down to Virginia land record. You know, what happened is, at this point in time, not loud enough? Hold it up. No? Good?
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, so this person was, he arrived in the year 1635, and there was something called the headright system. And the headright system for every person, because there was the need to settle the colony, right? There was the need to bring people in. And in this system, for every person you brought in, you got 50 acres of land. And then, of course, a lot of people brought friends and family and servants. And it appears that one landowner, this gentleman, Englishman, who had himself arrived in the year 1623, he brought over a number of servants, and we think they're servants, but headrights, and he, among them, so in the record when he registers the land, he says, these are the headrights, these are the people I brought over, and he lists 23 names. And of the 23 names, there's Tony, and as was the case with people of color back in the day, he's not given a last name. So there's John Smith, and Dick Hughes, and Tony East Indian. And that's the earliest record I could find of an East Indian in what is today the United States. I mean, some diligent historian might find someone who is earlier, but this is the earliest that I could find. So when I came across this bit of information, I was completely surprised, because this is not a piece of history that is known, that there was an East any East Indian that long ago. And eventually, there were other East Indians, you see, and I'm using the term East Indian because that was the term used, but we mean South Asian, broadly speaking South Asian, people from the Indian subcontinent. And, but you have mentions of East Indians through the 1600s, often as servants. The status is not entirely clear, were they servants, were they enslaved, it's not entirely clear. But there's a mention of a number of them, and there are in fact cases of a couple of them who even fought in the Revolutionary War on both sides, some in the British side, some on the side of the revolutionaries. And so there are a few scattered instances, but when I came across the figure of Tony, I said, this is my story. This is what I want to write about. For a number of reasons, I did not want to write the modern immigrant novel. It's been done by other authors, other Indians, and better than I could. And so I said, this is what I'll do. And since I studied the 1600s and my other part of my career, and I'm a specialist in Shakespeare, I thought this time period is something that really draws me and that I know a little bit about. So that's how I got to
Well, I'd love you to talk a bit about your other career. I know you've written fiction before and you're a Shakespeare scholar by trade, but this is your first novel in the US. So what was it like journeying from academics back into fiction?
It was difficult in a sense because it's very different parts of the self, that do both kinds of work. It's a very different part of you that writes essays and books and scholarly stuff, and it was difficult, and I had to keep the two apart in some ways. And it's not like I left one. I don't like the thought of. I don't like to say I've left one behind, and I do both, and I will continue to do both. It's the way I think about it. But one has to switch back and forth, and when you do one, you kind of leave the other. But this project, in a way, I pulled the two parts together, I think, more than I would with other projects, because it's the 1600s, and because it is, like I said, I know the time period, and I've brought Shakespeare in. I have to bring Shakespeare into everything I do, and I have, so I had, the other thing that inspired me, apart from the historical figure, is the little, for those of you who know A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we have one of our foremost Shakespeare experts in the country, actually, right here. Yeah, and she says, yeah, of course I know the little Indian boy, and so the there's a Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Some of you might know the play, and it's just a brilliant comedy, I think, fairies and birds and love potions and that kind of thing. And the fairy king and queen are fighting over, are quarreling over an Indian boy. And so I came to this novel from that direction. This Indian boy in this very English play. And there's a reference to the spiced Indian air, which is where it comes from. And so it's really both Shakespeare and the historical figure. And so this novel, I think, is more than my other work. I think I bring together the two parts of my writing and my personality.
Well, Midsummer Night's Dream ends up playing sort of a large role both in Tony's sort of imagined landscape and sort of thematically in the novel. And I think it's interesting that this single pair of lines affect him so deeply. And I'd love if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. When he watches the play in London, and Shakespeare's no longer alive then in 1635, but he's still new enough, and Tony watches the play, and he is surprised that there is an Indian boy in the play, and then in a way the Indian boy, the memory of this Indian boy follows him as he comes to Virginia and as he comes to the New World. He is haunted in some ways by this Indian boy. What is the Indian boy doing in that play? And I think it's the loneliness of the Indian boy in that world. What would he have been like? What would he have felt like? And why do they even want him? Why do the fairy king and queen even want him? And these are questions that he thinks about, and these are questions that he thinks about in relation to his own identity and his own place in Virginia. And later I had him doing things with love potions and things, pretty much like.
Yeah, I noticed that. I thought that was great.
Yeah, pretty much. So I brought in some of the Midsummer Night's Dream that there's a little, he plays a little trick with love potions and.
Yeah, there are some treats in the book that aren't explicit, that are still very clear if you know the play.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. So you said writing the contemporary immigration novel is not something you were interested in doing. But you, like Tony, were born in India but have spent decades here. So is there anything that you've drawn from your own experience that went into the way that he sort of conceives of the world and how he proceeds through it?
I think, yeah, some of it, definitely. I think generally speaking, when one writes a historical novel, you're also always writing about the present to an extent, right? And to an extent, yeah, my own experience, the experience of many people here in this room. I definitely drew on. I mean, this kind of constant mashing together of. I mean, for example, I interweave his memories of the Hindu gods, quite a bit, and it is something that is because I remember the first time I saw the New England Hindu temple, which was the first Hindu temple, and there was something almost, no offense to anyone, but it was almost incongruous in some ways, the sort of, the structure there in the middle of this very New England landscape. And I wasn't able to kind of bring the two together, and this is something I think the immigrant always struggles with. There is that world you've left behind, and there is this world here. And those two worlds don't always blend very easily, and they sit uneasy within you. I think the two parts of yourself always sit uneasy within you, and you do get used to it after some time. So I don't want to say that we live in a state of perpetual trauma or anything of that sort, But the two parts are there, and so this is something that I think I drew, and I draw on when I write about him, because at least in the initial part of the book, there's the constant memory of things that happen. But at some point in the novel, I had him decide that he is Virginian. He's here, there's no going back, and this is his world, and he says, this is where the wind laid me, and this is where I will be, and so he chooses to be Virginian. And after that, I did less of the reference to Indian mythology and that kind of thing as the book wears on. And he converts to Christianity. He's not a reluctant convert. That was important for me. I did not want him to be someone who's forced to convert. He decides he wants to convert to Christianity, and he does, and the memories get, I guess they fade a little bit more with time as time goes on. But yeah, certainly some aspects of my experience. And I think one aspect of the modern Indian experience, again, which a lot of people would understand I drew on, is we are mistaken for everyone under the sun a lot of the time. You're Hispanic, you are, which part of, are you North African? And, there's something about the way South Asians look. I think we could come from different parts of the world, and that's something he runs into over. Are you a Gypsy? Are you an Egyptian? Are you a Turk? Are you a Moor? Are you an African? Right, so he gets a bit of that. So that I definitely drew from.
Yeah. Well, that actually leads me to another question that I have. So I think one of the challenges of writing about anyone who isn't white in a historical novel is the kind of language that's wielded against and towards anyone who isn't white in history. And so I'm curious about your approach to using race-related language in this book, because I think it's very intentional, and I'm wondering what your process was in deciding how you would approach it.
Approaching, if you could be a little bit more...
Oh, sure. Like, what language do you use? How does the way that it works in the book interact with what you think of as your readers? That kind of thing.
It was a little bit tricky at points, right? One of the decisions we made in the process of editing the book is we decided we drop all racist, like overtly racist language with reference to groups that are not my group.
Mm-hmm.
That was a decision I made. And because of course this language was used, but I decided that I wouldn't use it. Mm-hmm. And Tony, of course, is called everything under the sun, and I retained some of that language. But the decision was made For example, language used about Native Americans, language used about Africans, and so on. I decided that I would not use it. And it's always a tricky thing. That's something I talk about even with my students, because on the one hand, not using this kind of, you don't want to whitewash the time period. I mean, imply that, everything was fine and no one was, that's the danger of not using racist language, because, of course, people were using it, and that was part of the brutality, right, of the time period. But at the same time, you have to be careful. You don't want, obviously hurt people's feelings by using it and traumatize people.
Well, and I think that you find a lot of other ways to very clearly describe the specific struggles and prejudices that different groups of people dealt with in this time period. Not just people of color, but also women, people with mental illnesses, gay people as well. So there are a lot of people in this book where you do give space to their specific struggles. Was that something that you were really intent on when you started out, or were those characters that you discovered?
I was quite intent. I was quite intent on that because, I did a lot of reading, a lot of study. I mean, almost 2 years of study of the time period, and there was tremendous prejudice against all kinds of groups, and I came across instances of cross-dressed men. I mean, you think of that as a modern phenomenon, but I came across instances of this. I came across references to homosexuality and of course, anti-Semitism. You see plenty of that, and so I very deliberately, in fact, I start the novel with a woman being hanged, accused of witchcraft and being hanged, which is, clearly, I mean, more women than men were accused of witchcraft, and so it was very intentional. I wanted to show the sort of the variety, the different kinds of marginalization and how they take place. Of course, and not every one of them is my story, but Tony is part of the landscape, and what he feels and what he experiences is part of something, of all of these other things that are also going on at the same time. Yeah.
Well, I think starting with the witch is actually really interesting, because in a lot of demographic ways, she's very, very different from Tony, but you're still drawing a parallel between them.
Yeah, that was the intent. I mean, at first, my editor was, and you'd be surprised how much editors have to do with and she was, do we really need the witch? And I said, no, we really do need the witch, because the witch, it's not just a sensational opening, because I begin, and I did read, by the way, about a woman who was accused of witchcraft in the year, a woman on board a ship. A little bit later, in the 1640s, a woman was, there was a trial on ship, and she was hanged on ship. And I changed the name, but it did happen. And the witch, I started with the witch not just because I wanted to be sensational, though of course an author is always looking for a good opening, but also because I wanted her, I wanted to draw parallels between her and Tony. Like you said, very different from Tony in many ways, but she in some ways is the one figure who he identifies with in a strange kind of way. And
there's like the moment of sympathy between them that sticks with him.
Yeah, and then I circled right back to witchcraft later, because one of the people he's very attached to is accused of witchcraft later in the play. Yeah.
There are two motifs that intertwine through the book. The idea of rebirth and a sort of phantasmic character referred to by Tony as the man who would not die. I would love you to talk a bit about the man who would not die, and also the kinds of rebirth that come into play in this story, because I think there's more than one.
Yeah, the man who would not die. The interesting thing about the 1600s is it is so, apart from other things, so bizarre, and it's so completely bizarre and crazy. And I came across this article in a popular history magazine about this man. You should listen. This is a man, a criminal in England. I don't know, it's not clear what he was accused of, but he was accused of some crime or the other, and he was sentenced to hanging, death by hanging. And they hang him, he does not die. And then they hang him again, and he does not die. And they hang him a third time, and he still does not die. I don't know why, but he does. It's either you have a very, very, very incompetent hangman, or a guy who's got an extraordinarily strong neck. but this man does not die. And so, by English law, no man can be hanged more than 3 times.
It's amazing that they had a law for that.
It obviously happened more than one. This is probably not the isolated case. And so they said, what do we do with this man? You know, we cannot hang him a 4th time, but he has, so they say we ship him to Virginia, you know, and so he comes to Virginia. So that's where I got the idea for the man who would not die. And Tony hears about this man at the beginning of the story, and he is fascinated by the figure. And who wouldn't be, right? A man who would not die 3 times. But he is fascinated by him. But then as the story goes on, and he visits Tony in a way, you know, as Tony goes through his life, every now and then he's visited in a manner of speaking by this man, and eventually the man becomes a symbol, you know, a symbol of persistence, you know, a symbol of the will to survive, and which is where I suppose the rebirth. I mean, of course, the idea of rebirth, right? The idea of rebirth is very much part of the sort of the Indian ethos, you know, that one does not die, but there is, you know, there is this next birth and a next and a next, and each one is a renewal, and it's a renewal in a way. And so I drew on the idea, and because what I had is my young man is someone who learns in many ways to live over and over and over again. And it is true in many ways for many of us who came here well into our adulthood in a way. You know, it is a rebirth. We start all over again. You know, we start all over. It is really, in many ways, and I see some people nodding here, in many ways it is like being born again. You know, it is, and you learn everything all over again. And so, which is why we all are about 20 years younger than we actually are. Right? And but my protagonist, he learns to, he is born again as a Virginian, right, when he leaves. And he decides at some point, and he knows at some point there's no going back, and this is his life. And that's one point where he decides that he is going to be, like I said earlier, where the wind laid me, and this is where the wind has laid me, and I will live here. So that's one rebirth. And then he's born again, in a manner of speaking again, when he decides that he's going to be an apothecary's assistant. And that happens almost accidentally, but he does become an apothecary's assistant, and so he's born again in that way. And by the way, the apothecary's assistant, some people would think would be far-fetched. I mean, which East Indian, which person of color is going to be an apothecary's assistant? But surprisingly, when you read medical records, there were Africans, for example, who were very well versed in medicine. And one Indian boy that I read about, East Indian boy, he was an apothecary's assistant in London. So it's not like I completely made it up. And he was shipped off to Virginia. You know, he was punished, as punishment, he was shipped off to Virginia. So he's born again in some ways. And later in the novel, he has to uproot and leave and go to Maryland, as it turns out, and so, you know, born again. So there's sort of multiple rebirths where each time he has to start over. And each starting over, I think, requires tremendous energy and will on his part. But I wanted this character who's got this will to survive. You know, in spite of the trauma, in spite of the pain and all of that, I also wanted someone who is strong and persistent and funny and all of that. Yeah.
Well, something I was thinking about Tony is that he's sort of a mythologically minded person, and it seems like he draws so much power from the stories that he tells himself, and I think that comes into play not only from there's the Shakespeare play, which he keeps thinking about for the rest of his life. He sees it once and he thinks about it for the rest of his life. He has, by halfway through the book, more than one religious foundation. And then there's also things with like his father, the way that he thinks about his father, and how the things he thinks about his father. If you want to talk about like how what he imagines about his father actually shapes his life.
Yeah, his father, he's the son of a courtesan, and the father is unknown. There's no, anyone could be the father, as he says, but he imagines a certain kind of father, a medicine man, and he has longings in some way of that father coming back and finding him and rescuing him in some ways at certain points in his life, but then eventually, and he lies about his father actually quite a bit. And I wanted a little bit of this kind of rascal protagonist, I was writing for those of us who know the tradition of the picaresque novel, right, where you have the journey, but you also have the character who's a bit of a rascal. And I wanted some of that, and so I was. So I have him actually lie quite a bit about his father and his background and several other things. Yeah.
Yeah, he gets up to a lot of mischief in this book.
Yeah. I did want. I did want someone who is sort of not, and. So he is, eventually he does, so he lies about the father being a medicine man, and somehow along the way he kind of starts believing that his father was really a medicine man, but then it turns out to be true. Yeah, it turns out to be.
They think lying is bad. So doctoring is Tony's ultimate passion, at least for a large part of his life. And physical illness is a sort of continuous presence in the book. And I'm wondering if there are any ways in which that illuminates some of your themes as well as just being like a physical reality of the setting.
I think this idea of course, there was the reality of the setting, right? There was death everywhere, right? There was death everywhere. I mean, it was all swamp and everyone knows. And they didn't know it was yellow fever at that point in time, but yellow fever, mosquito-borne illnesses. So, there was a lot of that. And it was it was among other things, and the thing that made life so completely precarious in this time period. But it's also in some sense the idea of healing, I think, is the idea. More than the sense of illness is the idea of healing that I wanted to carry through the story, that one has to somehow make oneself better, healthier, in a more metaphysical kind of way,
Well, I'm glad that you said that because I think there is a lot of death in this book and it makes sense and it's just omnipresent. But I wouldn't call this at all a hopeless book. This is a very hopeful book in many ways. So how do you go about sort of nurturing that hopefulness while also being deeply realistic about the sometimes short brutality of life?
Because I think that's the way it works, right? I mean, whether one talks of indentured servants or slaves or whoever, and I'm sure their lives were terrible and awful in every possible way. But I'm sure there was also moments of joy and moments of hope, I think, because I think that's human nature. We tend to hope in the most adverse of circumstances. And I wanted my character to feel that. And I think very importantly in fiction writing, I think sort of it's fiction writing 101. You need a character who wants. If your character does not want, you don't have a plot, right? I mean, you don't have a plot. You need a character who wants things, and my character clearly is someone who wants and hopes right from day one. And it's that energy, I think it's that desire that moves the story forward.
I would like to talk about names. Tony is given an Indian name when he is a child. But that's not something we learn, and it's something that sort of disappears from him as well. And I would love to hear how that connects both to his personal journey and his separation from his homeland.
Yeah, he has an Indian name, and he is given his English name, Tony, in India actually. He's given in India, and but I decided I would never ever mention the Indian name. And in fact, I don't even have an Indian name in my head. And I don't.
I did not expect that.
No, I do not have. So to me, he's Tony, and Indian names give away too much. That's part of the problem. They give away caste, they give away background, they give away linguistic, and I didn't want all of that. I didn't want to, get involved in all of that with Tony. And so I left all of that out of the story. And also, for me, he stays Tony, and as the novel goes on, he really claims that identity for himself, because like I said earlier, that's what he is and that's what he becomes. And there are times the name suits him, there are times the name sort of sits, in conflict with him, but then that's what he is, and that's the nature of his identity.
I'd like to talk a bit about research, because obviously this is an area, a time period in which you have a lot of pre-existing expertise. But obviously Shakespeare is a bit different from the Virginia colony. So what was the research process like? Were there any parts of it that really stood out as very exciting or interesting for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have studied the 1600s, and but of course my expertise is more in England really than in Virginia as such. So I'm very interested in questions of cross-cultural encounter and race, and that's the kind of work I do, and in the time period. But I have to read everything about Virginia. I had to start with Virginia, colonial Virginia 101, and luckily I had colleagues, experts in colonial American history, told me start with this, and so I read and read and read. I mean, I studied in fact, I took longer in my research than in the writing of the book. The research took much longer, but I love that kind of thing. So I truly love digging into the past. I really love engaging with the time, and I got completely fascinated by colonial Virginia, and it's so complex, and it is so interesting, and it is so in a way it encapsulates to me everything that was happening in the world at that point in time. We're talking early globalization and all of that, and so I have Tony, so I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of research, and I had to make sure particularly about the East Indian presence. I want to make sure I'm not getting that wrong, because almost anyone knows, because that's the premise, and I don't want someone jumping up and saying, no, there were no East Indians at all. And but I made sure I tracked them all down, and particularly Tony, like I said, I had to go back, look at the Virginia land records, that kind of thing, and it was challenging, it was difficult, it took a lot of time, but that is the kind of work I enjoy. That's so, it was, I think what is exciting about it is so many unexpected things. I think we have, today, I think we people who inhabit the 21st century kind of have this idea that people in the past were kind of somehow stupid, relative to us, that we are kind of smarter in some ways. And it is true, we are in many ways, we are better people in many ways. But there's a complexity and a depth to everyone at every point in history. And I think studying the past and really digging into the time period kind of drove that home to me, that these were complex, interesting people, and they had tremendous depth to them. They're just not representatives of their time period, right? Because there is the macro reality of the time period, but then these are also individuals. And no one is just a slave, no one is just an indentured servant, no one for that matter is just a landowner. They're also all individuals. And I think you have to be aware of the larger historical reality, but you also have to be aware that you're writing about individual life, and I think that is the exciting part of it.
Yeah, and the personalities in this book are all extremely distinct from one another. There's the voices of each character and their personalities are so separate. You never feel any blurring between them. So that's something that's really good about this book. So look forward to it. I have many questions, but soon we're going to pass it over to all of you. Yeah, actually, I think we can pass it over to everybody. So my last question for you is, you said that you were going to keep doing both kinds of work, so I wonder if you have another book that is on its way.
I do, yeah. Yeah, I have. This is a novel set in the 1800s, the early 1800s, and I decided, New England has been home for a long time to me. 18 years I've lived here in this area, and my entire family, many of whom are here, some of them are born New Englanders, and so I decided I'm writing this novel set in the Boston area and it's set in the world of popular entertainment. It appears there were early performers from all over the world who came to perform in the circuses, early American circus, and in the they were many magicians in the sense stage performers, and not the wizard kind of magicians, professional conjurers, and they came from, it was a truly international world. It's really surprising, you wouldn't think it, but the world of magic. And again, when I say magic, I don't mean the Harry Potter kind of magic, I mean people who performed on stage. It was truly international in the early 1800s, and people came from all over the world to London and then to this area, New York and so on, to perform. So I'm writing a novel based in that context.
That sounds wonderful. And I didn't ask you before, do you want to read or do you want them to read everything themselves?
What they prefer.
Yeah, I think we have time, so.
A little bit of reading?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just read a little bit of the prologue, not the whole thing. For those of you who are inclined to audiobooks, because Adams, who read the audiobook, is a far, far, far better reader than I can ever be. So this is not even a word. It's a shadow of what Because Adams does. But this is the prologue. And of course, I started on a ship because none of the story would have happened without ships. Right, and so he is on his way to Virginia, and he is on the ship called God's Gift, and which was the name of one of the ships. I don't know if that was the ship on which the East Indian came, but it is one of the ships that came to Virginia. And so he's on the ship, and so I started the ship. So I'll just read a little bit of that. So, a witch was hanged from the yard arm of the ship on the 4th week of my voyage to America. Some days before, we had stopped at the isles called the Azores to load wood and fresh water and were well on our way to the New World. They hanged the witch just before dusk. I was among those who gathered to watch as she was led up by 2 sailors, one on either side of her, her legs in chains, although she could not have gone far even if she had tried to flee. Her name was Anne Brady. It was May, and the winds that filled our sails and blew the God's Gift towards Virginia were still chilly, but the waters were quite tranquil. Captain Cox had conducted Mistress Brady's trial and had been judge and all the jury. He had set up court on the deck with an eager crowd of sailors and Virginia voyagers pressing around him. Being among the youngest, little Sammy Mason, Dick Hughes, and I were at the back of the crowd, straining to see and hear. The 3 of us were of the same age or thereabouts, between 10 and 15, with Sammy being the youngest, Dick being a bit older than I was. Sammy was a slight fellow, smaller even than me, and I was said to be small for my age. His eyes were the lightest I'd seen, bluish grey, like the sky on a certain kind of day. His hair was a thatch of gold and his face that of a girl. Sammy suffered from ulcers in his mouth through the journey. I recommended some of the medicinal powder I had filched from a London apothecary, but Sammy looked doubtful and would sit with his mouth hanging open, just to air out the insides, he said. And Dick and I would keel over with laughter at how foolish he looked. We were boys, and in spite of our unfortunate lot, we could laugh at just about anything. Dick, for his part, was tall and gangly with brown hair and green eyes, his face sorely afflicted with spots. He was good at doing things the sailors asked him to do, things with ropes and such, and one of them said he should consider working on a ship. And then there was myself, the brown-skinned boy, the East Indian who went by the name of Tony. "Where you hail from, lad?" the sailors asked me curiously. "Where your Moor friend from?" they asked Sammy and Dick. "Tony is an Indian from East India, sir," they explained. The sailors always looked surprised at that. "East India is a long way off, even further than America," one of them remarked. It was dawn on that occasion. The ship, which never fully slept, was stirring to renewed life. The distant horizon silently blared, red and pink. "It's somewhere that way," I said, pointing eastward. "Somewhere there." Dick and Sammy squinted at the sky, trying to catch a glimpse of the land from where I had started. "An East Indian," the bosun remarked, looking at me speculatively. "You're the first East Indian sailing to America, lad. Do not know if any have gone before you." Not knowing whether to be proud at that or dismayed, I smiled uncertainly. "What is Virginia like, sir?" Dick asked. He was not interested in talking about me. "Wood and water," the man replied. "Water and wood." And I imagined green forest and winding river, balanced on the outer edge of the world. And following this, I talk a little bit about the witch's trial. I talk a little bit about, again, people continue to be surprised, wonder where Tony's from and so on. And then I'll read a little bit of the end of the prologue where he talks about his one encounter he had with this woman who was accused of being a witch. I had been by myself looking over at the water, listening to the creak of the ropes, the groan of the wood, and the sound of the wind slapping against the sails. Mistress Brady had come to stand by my side. She had spoken first and asked me my name. I had told her it was Tony. Her gaze was unwavering. What was it before that, she'd asked. What did your mother call you, lad? But I would not tell her. I had lost that name somewhere on my earliest journey, the one that took me across 2 oceans to England. When she saw that a sullen silence was the only response she was going to get, she had not pressed me further. She had placed her hand beside where mine rested on the rail, and I saw that it was nearly as dark as mine, the skin of it rough from labor. I had looked up at her countenance and seen that her eyes were a deep brown, also almost the color of my own. There were some streaks of grey on her dark head, but there was yet a look of youth about her. At that moment, a sailor had come and roughly told her to shove off downstairs. She had thrust a piece of salted pork into my hand and ruffled my curls as if I was still a very small child. And then she was gone. So, a witch was hanged 4 weeks into our voyage to Virginia. After it was over, they hauled the body down and flung it into the water. Captain Cox trundled back to his cabin, and they shooed us down to the hold which stank of stale food, sweat, and vomit, but which was at least rid of the witch's envy and spite. We went on our way, breasting the grey-white waves, the ship mourning like a living beast, the winds pushing us briskly westwards. It has been many years now since that crossing, but in my mind, she still stands there, forever looking out at the waters, forever asking me my name, forever failing to reach her journey's end, and I, forever poised at the start of my own voyage. It was the year of our Lord 1635, and I, Tony, the East Indian, was the first of my kind, so they say, to reach America.
We do have a few minutes for questions from you, so raise those hands. Yes, in the front. Yes.
I'm imagining it must have been difficult for you to write as a first person because when historical fiction, they write in the omniscient voice, it is easier to do.
The first person is restricted in some. The first person is restricted in some. I'm so used to just shouting out in the classroom, right? Yeah, we don't feel it. Yeah, and the first person is restricted in some ways because, of course, you are restricted to the point of you are one person and you cannot move around in space and time as you would. But I deliberately chose the first person because I wanted it to be a very personal kind of narrative. I wanted it to be because the story is told by an older Tony, looking back on his life, and I wanted it to be the novel to be a process of recollection. And because of that, there are things he remembers, because none of us recall every single thing, right? So I had him remember some things, and there are things he forgets, there are things he makes up, which is what we tend to do, right? As we recall our lives. And I wanted to play with a little bit of that, the process of remembering and forgetting. And I also wanted parts of it to be a kind of confessional, and I think the first person lent itself to that.
So, if I can phrase this right, when I'm like reading academic writing or scholarly work, I'm like really keyed into like what the writer's question is. And I was wondering if there were any questions and what they were that were driving your work in the novel, or questions that came up at the end that you now have as a result of writing it.
I think the question that was driving me was I think one is the question of who am I and what am I doing here? And the what am I doing here part of not using it is very seriously asked, what am I doing here? What am I going to do here? Now that I find, because his movement is completely involuntary, he's just moved from place to place, yes, he said. And this question of, and what do I do? There are so many things outside my control, and so what does a person of this kind do when he finds himself so completely uprooted, and in a world where he so clearly doesn't belong, where does he find that sense of belonging? And I think the larger question beyond the individual question, and maybe this is the academic in me, and by the way, Emily here is also both an academic and she's a fellow Simon & Schuster author, and she's got her fantastic book coming out in a couple of months. Yeah,
It's very good.
Sharp Tank.
Shark Heart.
Yeah, and I think the larger question was this question of this. This is a world of early globalization, right? Early, what we would call globalization today, and I think the larger question that was what was the lived reality? When you talk about globalization, it's an abstract term. And what was the lived reality like? And how did this large movement of people from different parts of the world who never really encountered each other, how did it impact and change lives, and how did it impact and change people? And I think that was the question. I don't know if it's a very good answer.
You discussed like writing about the dichotomy of the immigrant. You also just mentioned that the first person was served as a professional for you in some regards. Was it cathartic for you, or did the opposite happen? Do you feel even more this day-to-day maybe your justification for just that, like kind of reconciling it, but now writing about the process of it instead of the present?
What is it?
The dichotomy itself, did you reach more resolution or less?
No, but I think one comes to terms with the dichotomy. Yeah. I think that's the way it is. I don't think it was any sense of resolution or anything of that sort, but one comes to terms with the fact there are these two parts of you, and the two parts of you are never going to completely reconcile, and it's never going to be. But that is you. In fact, it is what you call the dichotomy. That is becomes your identity, and you're not even looking for resolution after a point, and that is your identity. That is the way you are, frank. And so I think that was it. I don't think there was any sense of resolution or catharsis or anything of that sort. But I think it made me understand and think about and forced me to reflect on how there are these two aspects of oneself, and one is the both. Yeah.
I also live in the Boston area. I was wondering why you chose Virginia to write your story. We could easily have moved story to the New England
I should
area.
have just moved it. It might have been easier, right? It might have been easier because I'm sort of a little bit more familiar with. I had to study. I mean, Virginia, studying law. I had to study the plants that grow in Virginia. I had to get to know the names of the flowers in Virginia, and the weather is not exactly the same as here, right? So I had to study. I had a lot more study. It would have been easier if I had moved into New England. But I just felt that part of it I could not change. I mean, he came to Virginia, and I had to keep it Virginia, and New England, of course, was also the Puritans had arrived and all of that, but the Virginia had a completely different feel to it. That early settlement of Virginia was a kind of different process, and I wanted, and of course, by the end of the movement from indentured servitude to institutionalized slavery is a very, historians debate, how exactly it happened and how it took place and so on. So it's not a neat movement. Because earlier on the indentured servants, but by the time you reach the 1660s, we have legalized, institutionalized, racialized slavery. And I wanted to write that too, because by the end of the novel, slavery has taken over. And it's starting to take over. Not, people are being marked as slaves by the end of the novel. And that was clearer, and there was more of that happening in Virginia than in New England. So I had a lot more to draw on. Yeah, that's the reason. Okay.
I remember you were talking about how Tony doesn't remember his name, and I think that's sort of to I think you were talking about how Tony doesn't speak, remember his original Indian name. There are a lot of instances of certain mysteries about his past life in India. Do you feel like that sort of ambiguity is liberating in a way that is open a wider thematic?
That is what? Liberating.
Open a wider thematic comparative canvas, or is there a part of you as a writer who really wants to tie up these ends and more?
About his past.
Yeah.
No, I wanted some of it to be unclear. I wanted some of it to be things he simply does not remember. And I wanted some of the aspects of his past to be stuff he lies about. Because I wanted him to be a character who is clearly very rooted. He comes from a certain part of the Coromandel coast in India. I wanted him to be from there, but I also wanted him, in some sense, to be a free being, and for that there are parts of the past which he has to forget, which have to be left free. I didn't want to root him too clearly in the context of the conflict of the past and all of these other things that shape Indian identity.
Thank you. You talked about the history and you talked about Shakespeare. Are there any, you were just talking about it being set in Virginia, and the only other truly great novel I know from that period is Toni Morrison's A Mercy. So I was thinking about whether there are other writers of novels or anything else of the contemporary moment whose voices work. The other person that came to mind was Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land, and the idea of finding one little line and then constructing a whole world around that. But are any of these contemporary creative voices in your head? Or is that hopeful or not?
Oh yeah, I mean, no, there was very little, surprisingly, as you say, there was very little fiction set in Virginia or any part of the United States. There are a couple of novels in New England and so on, I think. But anyway, I cannot remember the name off the moment, but offhand. But yeah, and it was a little bit disappointing to me when I started because I could find almost no fiction set in this time period in Virginia, and so I had. Because a big part of writing a novel is you are talking to other novels. That's a major part. People always are interested in the relationships between fiction and reality. But a lot of the relationship is between one book and the other. And I really did not have much to talk to. And I was disappointed, but then later I said, okay, this is actually not good for me. But certainly I think historical fiction, the titles you mentioned, and I certainly drew on a lot of them, the process of how does one, through fiction, recall and recover the past? And one of the things any historical novelist does is look for the voices that are lost, right? And that is what we can do. Because these voices are not there. They're mentioned in the archives. I mean, there's a Tony Easton in the archives, but he is not even a footnote to American history today. And so what we can do, I think, as fiction writers, is to give voice to these footnotes in a way, and to make them the center, the main text, to make them the center of the story. And I think many of the historical novelists do that. But I think historical fiction in general has helped me think about why and how does one, as a fiction writer, recall and write about the past, and what is the need? Some people would say, what is the need? I think that's the way I engaged with it. I think they helped me not so much because they work with this time period, these other authors, but because they're all in the process of recovering the past and reimagining it, right? Because it's different from the work a historian does, right? You're not simply recovering the past. You're taking it and you are, with the sacrilege to the story, you are reshaping it completely. And so that's what I got at from historical fiction.
One more.
So you said that your research took longer than that. What was your favorite part of the research?
I think the favorite part of the research was just encountering so many unexpected things about the time period. As I said earlier, we tend to simplify the past, and like I said, I came across instances of people, I came across references, for example, to same-sex desire, which we sort of think is a modern invention and did not exist back in the day, and so I came across references to that. I came across references to people we would call transgender, today, and there was actually a court case in Virginia. And it's very interesting the way Virginia dealt with that kind of really quite different from the way we dealt with it in Puritan New England. So they made a big deal of it, and then they are like, okay, whatever. There are other things that matter more, and so it was. So I think those are the things. There are so many things about the past which we don't know, aspects which are so modern in some ways, which are so contemporary in some ways. It makes you realize the depth of the past, the complexity and the depth of the past, and it really is, So I think those are the things. Those little details. Some of which I put into the book, but some of which you cannot put everything in, and some of the things I did not. But I think those are and I learned. The other favorite thing I should say is I learned a lot about early modern medicine. I mean, I can administer all the cures, and
Just don't administer those children.
yeah, I can, I don't know, heal people with, I don't know, pig's blood, and I mean, some of the it was like truly horrifying early modern medicine, and I became quite an expert, and I really did, and I truly, I mean, I'm sure it was horrifying for the people who were there and had to undergo those treatments, but I loved it. I just truly, completely loved it. I loved the stories of, you know, I mean, there was one story I put in here, and this is clearly in the record, of this man who lives to the age of 135. And why? All because he ate rancid cheese. And so that's what the doctors recommend. If you want to live long, eat rancid cheese.
And there's no better place to stop. Thank you so much.